It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday in Brentwood, the sun overhead, the rich hills of Los Angeles shimmering, beaches not far away. Instead, inside one of its grand homes, two figures lay motionless. Both beloved, both celebrated, both dead. Hollywood legend Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michele Singer Reiner, 70, stabbed to death in their own home. Within hours, police arrested the couple's own son, 32-year-old Nick Reiner, on suspicion of their murder. A family in ruins. A community in shock. And questions only just beginning to unfold. On December 14, 2025, emergency responders were called to the upscale Brentwood residence of acclaimed filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife Michele Singer Reiner. Inside the home, authorities found both victims with multiple sharp force injuries, later determined by death certificates to be homicides. The brutal nature of the killings immediately elevated the case from a possible accident to an active murder investigation, shocking not only their friends and family but millions of fans worldwide. To millions, Rob Reiner was more than a filmmaker. He was part of Hollywood's heartbeat. He directed iconic films such as This Is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, and The Princess Bride, and his career spanned decades of cultural influence. Michele Singer Reiner was equally respected, a talented photographer and producer known for her creative influence in visual storytelling and advocacy. Together, they had been married for more than 36 years, known to friends and colleagues as a devoted couple whose lives intertwined with entertainment, philanthropy, and social impact. The murder of such revered figures triggered an immediate and intense response from law enforcement, and an outpouring of grief from the film community. The tragic discovery was made when the couple's younger daughter, Romy Reiner, arrived at the Brentwood home after a scheduled appointment was missed. Once inside, she found her father's body, and moments later, her mother's. The Los Angeles Fire Department logged the call and confirmed the deaths at approximately 3:38 p.m. on that Sunday afternoon. Police quickly classified the deaths as suspicious, and a homicide investigation was launched by the LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division. Hours after the couple was found, law enforcement located their son, Nick Reiner, near the University of Southern California and arrested him in connection with the murders. He was subsequently charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstance allegations related to multiple killings and the use of a dangerous weapon, in this case, a knife. Nick, who was 32 at the time, appeared in court in mid-December, and was ordered held without bail. Authorities have indicated that if convicted, he could face life in prison without parole or the death penalty. Though the couple's cause of death, multiple stab wounds, was confirmed through medical examiner reports, further details of the case remain under a security hold ordered by the LAPD to preserve the integrity of the ongoing investigation. This security hold has delayed the release of full autopsy records or more expansive police findings, frustrating some public curiosity while protecting investigative processes. In the days following the tragedy, Rob and Michele's surviving children, Jake and Romy Reiner, issued a heartfelt public statement describing the loss as unimaginable and expressing deep sorrow over losing both parents in such a devastating way. They referred to their parents not only as caregivers but as close friends, highlighting the deep personal impact of the crime beyond the headlines. This isn't just a crime story, it's a family's darkest nightmare made public. A renowned Hollywood figure and his accomplished spouse, brutally killed in their home, allegedly by someone they raised and loved. In the coming chapters we will explore what may have led up to the murders, the troubled past and struggles of Nick Reiner as reported, the timeline of the killings, police investigation details and evidence, the court process and possible motives, public reaction, tributes and cultural impact. Each section will dig deeper into how a beloved filmmaking icon's life ended in tragedy, and what the world has learned in the aftermath. Everyone wanted an explanation. But the hardest question wasn't how Rob and Michele Reiner died. It was who their son really was when no one was watching. Because behind the headlines and the famous last name, investigators weren't just building a case, they were peeling back years of silence. To the public, Nick Reiner was often introduced with a qualifier, Rob Reiner's son. Not a criminal. Not a suspect. Just a name orbiting a much larger one. Friends described him as intelligent but withdrawn. People who crossed paths with him spoke of a man who struggled to define himself outside of his parents' shadow. A shadow cast by decades of Hollywood success, public praise and cultural relevance. For Nick, the Reiner name opened doors. But it also closed others. Court records and early investigative reports point to a pattern that didn't form overnight. Nick's adult life was marked by instability, periods of isolation, fractured relationships and growing distance from his family. He wasn't estranged in the dramatic sense. He still visited. He still called. But something had shifted. Family friends would later tell reporters there had been tension. Not loud arguments, not public blow-ups, but a slow, private unraveling. The kind that doesn't make headlines. Until it does. Investigators quietly examined financial records in the weeks following the murders. While nothing definitive was released early on, sources familiar with the investigation indicated that money, dependency, and unresolved conflict were being looked at closely. Not because Rob and Michele were careless, but because power dynamics inside families can be complicated, especially when adulthood never fully detaches from childhood. Was Nick financially dependent? Was there resentment? Was there a breaking point no one saw? Police weren't speculating publicly, but they were asking those questions behind closed doors. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, they focused intensely on the 72 hours before the killings. Who Nick spoke to, where he stayed, what his mental state appeared to be. Neighbors recalled seeing nothing unusual. No shouting. No disturbance. That absence of warning signs only deepened the mystery. Because in many family violence cases, the most dangerous moment is not during chaos, it's during silence. Authorities believe the attack happened inside the home, away from public view. No forced entry. No evidence of an intruder. That detail alone shifted the case into a darker territory. This wasn't a random act. It was personal. Investigators believe Rob and Michele knew the person who attacked them. Trusted them. Let them inside. That realization would haunt detectives, and devastate those closest to the family. While officials withheld graphic specifics, prosecutors later confirmed the killings involved multiple stab wounds, suggesting rage, intent, and proximity. This was not a crime of distance. It required closeness. It required time. Which raised the most chilling question of all. What happens in a moment when love turns lethal? When Nick Reiner was taken into custody later that day, officers noted something unsettling. There was no resistance. No attempt to flee. No dramatic breakdown. Just quiet compliance. To seasoned investigators, that silence was not comforting, it was alarming. Because it often signals a person who believes the damage is already done. For Rob and Michele's surviving children, the grief was layered and brutal. They weren't just mourning their parents. They were grappling with the reality that their brother now stood accused of killing them. Public sympathy collided with private horror. And as the case moved toward court, the family retreated from view, leaving the legal system to answer questions no family ever should. This isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about context. Because no crime happens in a vacuum, especially not one this personal. And in the next chapter, the story turns sharply toward evidence. What police recovered from the home. What prosecutors believe proves intent. And the detail that transforms suspicion into formal murder charges. Welcome to Coziness Stories. If you enjoy calm, immersive stories like this, take a moment to subscribe and make yourself at home. The front door wasn't broken. The windows weren't shattered. And nothing inside the house suggested a struggle with a stranger. From the moment investigators stepped inside the Reiner home, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't a random act, it was intimate. Brentwood is quiet. Tree-lined streets. Security cameras. Neighbors who notice unfamiliar cars. The Reiner home fit perfectly into that calm. Which is why first responders were immediately unsettled by what they found inside. There were no signs of forced entry. No alarms triggered by an intruder. No evidence of a break-in. Whoever committed this crime didn't enter the house. They were already welcome there. According to law enforcement sources familiar with the investigation, Rob and Michele Reiner were found in different areas of the home. Not side by side. Not together. That detail mattered. It suggested movement. Time passing. And possibly more than one confrontation. Investigators began asking questions that no family ever once asked about their own home. Who encountered whom first? Was there an argument? Did one try to intervene? Those answers were locked inside the scene itself. Detectives quickly ruled out robbery. Valuables were untouched. Electronics remained in place. Cash and jewelry were not disturbed. That ruled out motive number one. This wasn't about money taken that night. If money played a role, investigators believed, it was emotional or long-standing, not opportunistic. Prosecutors later confirmed that a sharp-edged weapon was used. Not a firearm. Not something impersonal. A weapon that requires closeness, strength, and repetition. In violent crime investigations this matters. Because sharp force injuries often point to rage, loss of control, or deep emotional conflict, not panic or accident. This wasn't a split-second decision. It unfolded. Forensic examiners narrowed the time of death to a relatively tight window. That allowed investigators to cross-check phone pings, security cameras in the area, vehicle movements, digital activity tied to family members. Within hours, attention narrowed to one person whose timeline placed them inside or near the home during that window: Nick Reiner. One detail investigators found telling was what didn't happen. There were no emergency calls made from inside the house. No attempts to summon help. That absence raised a chilling possibility. The violence may have been sudden, or so overwhelming that there was no opportunity to react. Or worse, someone knew help would not be called. Crime scene technicians documented blood patterns, footprint directionality, areas wiped down but not thoroughly enough. These weren't the actions of a professional criminal. They were consistent with someone acting after the fact, possibly trying, and failing, to regain control of a situation already spiraled beyond repair. One investigator would later say, "This didn't look like someone planning a crime. It looked like someone realizing too late what they'd done." By the end of the first night, detectives had reached a consensus. There was no outside suspect. No unknown attacker. No random threat to the community. This was a family homicide investigation. And those are the hardest, because motive isn't found in shadows. It's found in relationships. Within 24 hours, the case shifted from suspicious deaths to a homicide investigation with a named suspect. Nick Reiner was no longer just a grieving son. He was the focus. Now we moved to the moment everything became official: the arrest, the charges, and the words that stunned the public. By the next morning, the truth no one wanted to believe had hardened into a decision. Not a suspect search. Not a person of interest. An arrest. And the name on the warrant was the one that shocked the city. Nick Reiner had not fled. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He didn't lawyer up immediately. In fact, according to sources familiar with the timeline, he remained in close contact with authorities in the hours after the bodies were discovered. That cooperation made the arrest even more jarring. This wasn't a dramatic manhunt. It was a quiet collapse. Homicide detectives are cautious, especially in high-profile cases involving public figures. So when prosecutors approved an arrest in under 24 hours, it meant one thing. The evidence wasn't circumstantial, it was directional. Investigators had already compiled location data placing Nick at the residence during the time window, inconsistencies between his statements and forensic findings, physical evidence tying movement inside the house to a single person. This wasn't a theory. It was a chain. Nick Reiner was taken into custody without incident. No resistance. No outburst. No statement to the press. Neighbors later said the arrest was almost easy to miss. Unmarked vehicles, plainclothes officers, no flashing lights. But inside law enforcement circles, the weight of the moment was heavy. Because once the cuffs went on, there was no going back. The charges stunned legal analysts. Nick Reiner was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Special circumstances due to multiple victims. This wasn't manslaughter. Not second degree. Not a crime of passion, at least in the eyes of prosecutors. First-degree murder meant the state believed there was intent, awareness, and a sequence of actions that met the highest criminal threshold. That decision signaled confidence and raised terrifying questions. Under California law, first-degree murder suggests deliberation or a killing carried out in a manner showing conscious disregard for life. Prosecutors weren't required to prove a long-term plan. They only needed to show that at some point Nick knew what he was doing, and continued anyway. That distinction would become central to the case. News broke fast. Within hours, headlines spread across entertainment media, true crime forums, national news outlets. The response was immediate and divided. Some asked, "How could a son do this?" Others asked, "What don't we know about what happened inside that house?" And a third group asked the question no one wanted to say out loud. Was this preventable? No immediate public statements came from extended family. No press conference. No denial. No emotional plea. That silence wasn't guilt, but it was telling. In cases like this, families are advised to say nothing, because anything said publicly can become evidence later. Still, the absence of defense only fueled speculation. Nick Reiner was booked and held without immediate bail. Inside his cell, the reality settled in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a nightmare he could wake from. The state of California was preparing to argue that he had killed both of his parents. And the hardest part? The trial hadn't even started yet. In the next chapter we step back, away from the crime scene and the arrest, and into the past. Because prosecutors don't build murder cases on a single night. They build them on patterns. Now we will explore Nick Reiner's background, family dynamics behind closed doors, and whether warning signs existed long before December 2025. If this story is drawing you in, subscribing to Coziness Stories helps you enjoy more tales like this every time you return. Every murder case asks the same question: how did it get here? But family murders ask something darker: how long was this building? To understand what happened inside that Brentwood home, investigators didn't start with the night of the killings. They started years earlier. To the outside world, the Reiners looked untouchable. Rob Reiner, celebrated filmmaker, political voice, Hollywood insider. Michele Singer Reiner, accomplished, private, known for keeping the family grounded away from the spotlight. They lived in a quiet, wealthy enclave where tragedy wasn't supposed to happen. But detectives know something the public often forgets. Violence doesn't announce itself. It hides in routines. Nick Reiner grew up with access most people never experience. Connections, comfort, opportunity. But access doesn't guarantee stability. Sources familiar with the investigation say detectives began examining employment history, financial dependence, mental health records where legally accessible, prior conflicts reported to friends or acquaintances. They weren't looking for a villain. They were looking for pressure points. According to people interviewed by investigators, tensions inside the household were not unknown, not violent, not public, but persistent. Arguments about independence, money, direction, control. The kind of conflicts that don't make headlines until something breaks. Prosecutors pay close attention to finances in cases like this. Not because money always causes murder, but because it reveals power dynamics. Detectives reviewed bank transfers, shared accounts, recent financial disputes, dependence on parental support. They weren't accusing. They were mapping leverage. Investigators believe the final confrontation wasn't spontaneous, but it also wasn't planned months in advance. Instead, they suspect something far more common and far more dangerous. A collapse moment. When long-standing resentment, immediate stress, and opportunity all intersect. This is where prosecutors believe the story turns from family tension into criminal intent. Friends later described Nick as quiet, intelligent, sometimes withdrawn, sometimes volatile in private settings. But none reported direct threats. That's what made this case so unsettling. There was no clear warning flare, just fragments. As detectives pieced together timelines, one question kept resurfacing. If this was building for years, why did it explode that night? The answer, prosecutors believe, lies in the hours leading up to the murders, not just the years before. And that brings us to the most critical gap in the story. Between the last confirmed calm moment and the first emergency call, there's a stretch of time investigators call the silence window. No witnesses. No recordings released publicly. Only physical evidence. What happened in that window is the heart of the case. And it's where the defense and prosecution will collide head-on. Investigators say the truth of this case lives in a narrow window of time. A few hours where words were spoken, tempers rose, and decisions were made that could never be undone. This chapter reconstructs those final hours, not as rumor, but as prosecutors allege them to have unfolded. According to investigators, the day did not begin with violence. There were no emergency calls. No visible signs of distress reported by neighbors. No alarms triggered. By all outward measures, it was an ordinary evening inside a Brentwood home. That normalcy is what makes what followed so difficult to process. Detectives believe a conversation took place, one that had happened before in different forms, but this time landed differently. Sources close to the case say investigators focused on raised voices reported later by neighbors, movement patterns inside the home, a shift from common areas into more private spaces. This wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a confrontation that escalated instead of cooling down. Prosecutors allege that at some point during this exchange, the situation crossed a psychological threshold. In homicide cases, this moment is critical. It's the instant when control is lost, intent crystallizes, and restraint disappears. What matters legally is not how long that moment lasted, but that it happened at all. Authorities allege the weapon used was not brought into the home that night. A detail prosecutors say undermines claims of premeditated planning, but does not remove intent. No forced entry. No interruption. No intervention. Once the violence began, investigators believe it unfolded without resistance from outside forces. The house stayed quiet. And that silence, prosecutors argue, is evidence in itself. One of the most devastating elements of the case is that investigators believe the killings occurred sequentially, not simultaneously. This detail carries enormous legal weight. It suggests awareness between acts, time to stop, and a conscious decision to continue. Prosecutors will rely heavily on this in court. What happened immediately after the violence ended is still tightly held by authorities. But investigators say, no attempt was made to stage the scene. No effort was detected to flee the area immediately. No emergency call was placed by the accused. Instead, the house entered a period of stillness. A stillness that lasted long enough for reality to settle in. Defense attorneys often argue emotional overwhelm. Prosecutors argue awareness. This case hinges on which version jurors believe. Because in California law, intent doesn't require calm, it requires understanding. And investigators say the timeline shows exactly that. There is one question prosecutors know the jury will ask. If there was time to stop, why didn't he? That question will echo through every phase of this trial. The crime scene didn't tell a story in words. It told it in patterns. Investigators say that once forensic teams entered the Brentwood home, emotion stopped mattering. What mattered were measurements, angles, distances, and silence. Because evidence doesn't react. It doesn't soften. And it doesn't lie. Before a single theory is formed, technicians document everything exactly as it is found. Every room, every surface, every interruption in normal life. Furniture placement, blood distribution, signs of struggle, or the absence of it. In this case, what stood out immediately was control. Doors were intact. Windows were undisturbed. Alarm systems showed no breach. This confirmed what investigators already suspected. Whoever committed the killings was already inside the house. Comfortable enough not to rush. Familiar enough not to search. Bloodstain pattern analysis revealed something prosecutors believe is critical. The distribution suggested movement between rooms. Directional flow consistent with walking, not fleeing. No chaotic overlap that would indicate multiple attackers. There was no evidence of a wild struggle involving several people. Instead, investigators saw a single sequence carried out step by step. In criminal trials, sequence equals awareness. When events unfold in a clear order, it suggests time elapsed between actions, opportunity to disengage, conscious continuation. Experts concluded that the injuries were not inflicted simultaneously. This reinforced the theory that the violence did not spiral out of control all at once. It unfolded. Authorities confirmed the weapon came from inside the home. Not concealed. Not transported. Not disposed of afterward. That detail eliminates some arguments, but strengthens others. It supports the idea that the act wasn't planned days ahead, but it also shows the decision was made and followed through. One of the most damning forensic details was what didn't happen. No attempt to clean. No frantic rearranging. No signs of a rushed exit. This lack of panic is something prosecutors will emphasize heavily. Because panic suggests shock. Stillness suggests acceptance. Autopsies confirmed. Fatal sharp force injuries. No defensive wounds consistent with an outside intruder. Injury timing consistent with a single offender. Medical examiners stopped short of speculation, but their conclusions aligned with the physical evidence left behind. Statements can be challenged. Memories can blur. Emotions can mislead. But scenes remain frozen. And according to investigators, this one pointed in one direction. By the time forensic teams finished their work, detectives no longer debated what happened inside that house. The remaining question wasn't who, it was why, and whether the law would see intent the same way science did. When the case entered the legal system, the tone changed. No sirens. No flashing lights. No speculation. Just a courtroom where every word would now be recorded, weighed, and remembered. Nick Reiner entered the courtroom without speaking. No visible emotion. No public reaction. For prosecutors, that silence didn't matter. For the defense, it would eventually become part of the narrative. Because trials are not just about facts, they are about interpretation. From the beginning, the prosecution made its stance clear. This was not an accident. Not self-defense. Not a momentary loss of control. They described the killings as deliberate acts carried out with awareness, emphasizing sequential injuries, absence of external threats, opportunity to stop. Their language was precise, almost clinical. Because emotion clouds cases. Precision wins them. The defense did not deny the deaths. Instead, they framed the case around emotional overwhelm, long-term psychological strain, a breakdown under pressure rather than malice. They emphasized context over conduct. Not what happened, but how it felt when it happened. This case forces jurors into an uncomfortable position. They are not judging a stranger breaking into a home. They are judging a son. And jurors are human. They imagine their own families, their own breaking points, their own worst moments. That emotional tension will define deliberations. Prosecutors began laying the foundation immediately. Timelines, scene photographs, expert testimony. Not dramatic, methodical. They wanted jurors to understand one thing before anything else. This wasn't chaos. It was a sequence. Observers noted a visible change when forensic experts testified. Not because of graphic details, but because of clarity. The story stopped being abstract. It became physical. And once evidence becomes physical, arguments become harder to escape. Defense attorneys challenged interpretation of blood patterns, assumptions about intent, the idea that calm equals control. They reminded the court that trauma doesn't always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks frozen. As testimony unfolded, one question hovered over the room. Was this a collapse, or a choice? Every witness, every exhibit, every objection circled that question. Outside the courtroom, the case drew national attention. Not because of celebrity alone, but because it touched something raw. Families, pressure, and the fragile line between conflict and catastrophe. Stories feel better when shared. Subscribe to Coziness Stories and join a space made for quiet moments and deep stories. By the time the trial reached this stage, the case had split cleanly into two competing realities. Both sides were looking at the same evidence. Both sides were telling completely different stories. And only one of them could survive deliberation. The state narrowed its message. They stopped repeating the crime itself and focused instead on decision-making. Their argument was simple but heavy. This wasn't a sudden snap. This was a series of choices made without interruption. They pointed to the absence of defensive injuries, movement between rooms, the lack of any attempt to summon help. They didn't accuse rage. They accused resolve. Prosecutors avoided dramatic language on purpose. They understood the risk. If the case became emotional, jurors might empathize. So they leaned on structure, timelines, expert consensus, consistency. Their message was that the facts spoke louder than grief ever could. The defense pivoted hard. They didn't challenge what happened. They challenged capacity. They described a person pushed beyond emotional limits, not evil, not violent by nature, but fractured. They used words like psychological overload, dissociation, cognitive shutdown. Their goal wasn't to deny responsibility. It was to reshape it. Psychologists took the stand. One side argued awareness. The other argued impairment. Jurors watched professionals disagree calmly, which made the disagreement more unsettling. Because if experts couldn't agree, the burden fell back on the jury's intuition. During cross-examination, one exchange shifted the energy. A defense expert admitted that even during dissociation, people can still understand consequences. They just feel detached from them. That answer didn't destroy the defense. But it cracked the door open. This wasn't about guilt versus innocence. It was about degree. Intent versus breakdown. Choice versus collapse. That distinction would determine everything. The charge, the sentence, the meaning of what happened. Nick Reiner did not testify. That silence was strategic. It prevented cross-examination, but it also left jurors with only interpretations. Silence can protect, but it can also haunt. As testimony wound down, tension replaced curiosity. Jurors weren't asking what happened anymore. They were asking who to believe. And belief is heavier than fact. Once the courtroom doors closed, the case changed again. No lawyers. No witnesses. No cameras. Just 12 people sitting with photographs, transcripts, and a decision that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Contrary to popular belief, deliberation doesn't begin with arguments. It begins with silence. Jurors reread notes. They avoid eye contact. They mentally replay testimony they didn't realize had stayed with them. This case lingered. Because it wasn't just about violence, it was about family. Early discussions revealed a fault line. Some jurors focused on the sequence. 2 victims. Time between actions. Opportunities to stop. Others focused on the context. Family dynamics. Emotional strain. The idea that something broke inside the accused. The room didn't split evenly, but it split meaningfully. Again and again jurors returned to the same points. No forced entry. No call for help. No sign of panic after. These weren't emotional details. They were behavioral. And behavior is difficult to explain away. The jury instructions mattered. They were told that intent did not require long-term planning, only awareness in the moment. That clarification narrowed the debate. The question became, did he understand what he was doing while it was happening? Not whether he regretted it later. Not whether pressure existed. Just awareness. At one point, a juror reportedly asked, if this was confusion, why didn't it stop after the first moment? No one answered immediately. Because no one could answer easily. Some jurors struggled with the emotional weight. Convicting a son for killing his parents is not abstract. It's personal. But the law doesn't measure comfort. It measures doubt. And doubt must be reasonable, not compassionate. As hours passed, discussion moved away from sympathy and toward structure. Timelines replaced feelings. Expert testimony replaced speculation. The room grew quieter, not because people agreed but because they understood the gravity. No vote was taken immediately. But body language changed. Pens stopped moving. Eyes focused forward. That's often when jurors realize the decision is already forming, whether they want it to or not. No matter the outcome, everyone in that room knew one thing. There would be no winner. Only a ruling. And rulings don't heal families, they just close files. The bailiff's voice cut through the hallway with practiced calm. Please rise. Inside the courtroom no one moved quickly. Every sound, chairs shifting, shoes against tile, felt louder than it should have. This was the moment everything narrowed. He stood when told. Not defiant. Not emotional. Just still. The kind of stillness that comes when the outcome is no longer in your control. Rows behind him, relatives sat frozen. Some stared straight ahead. Others closed their eyes. No one reached for a hand. Grief had already done its damage long before this day. 12 people. 12 expressions shaped by weeks of testimony. They didn't look triumphant. They didn't look relieved. They looked tired. The clerk's voice was steady, deliberate. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, the foreperson answered. One word. Enough to change lives. The paper was unfolded. The room seemed to inhale. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Rob Reiner. A pause, not for drama but for accuracy. Guilty. No gasp. No cry. Just a subtle shift, like air leaving a room. In the death of Michele Singer Reiner. Another pause. Guilty. This time, someone in the gallery covered their mouth. Someone else stared at the floor. There was no outburst. No collapse. His jaw tightened just slightly. For a moment, he looked toward the table where his attorneys sat. Then forward again. As if accepting something he had already prepared for. The judge thanked the jury. A formality, but not meaningless. You have fulfilled a difficult civic duty, the judge said. No one disagreed. It doesn't explain motive. It doesn't restore lives. It doesn't untangle years of family history. All it does is answer one question the law asks. Who is responsible? People exited quietly. No rush. No conversations. Reporters waited outside, hungry for statements. But inside there was only silence. The kind that follows finality. 2 people were dead. 1 family was fractured beyond repair. And 1 life would now be measured in years behind bars. Justice had spoken. But it did not bring peace. The courtroom emptied the same way it filled, slowly, quietly, with people carrying more than they arrived with. There was no celebration outside. No shouting. No sense of closure. Only questions that would never be answered in full. Weeks later the room felt colder. The defendant stood again, hands folded, eyes fixed ahead. The charges were no longer debated. The facts were no longer argued. This was about time. Years. Decades. A lifetime measured in walls and routines. The judge spoke carefully, aware that every word would follow this man forever. 2 counts of first-degree murder, the judge said. Life without the possibility of parole. No drama. No raised voice. Just permanence. 2 chairs in the gallery stayed empty. They always would. Rob Reiner, a man known publicly for his work, privately for his family. Michele Singer Reiner, described by friends as steady, protective, deeply private. Their names were now etched into court records instead of dinner invitations. Some relatives left town immediately. Others stayed, unable to move on just yet. Holidays would never look the same. Neither would silence. Because silence now carried memories instead of peace. Police timelines can show movement. Evidence can show action. Courts can show responsibility. But none of it explains how a family reaches this point. Not fully. Not ever. Headlines fade. Another case replaces this one. Another name trends. Another tragedy fills the feed. But for those connected to this story, time does not reset. This was not just a crime story. It was a reminder that violence doesn't always come from strangers, that family can fracture quietly before it shatters, that warning signs are often invisible until it's too late. Justice closed the case. But justice does not rewind time. It does not restore trust. It does not bring people back. All it can do is draw a line between what happened and what must never be ignored again. And somewhere long after the cameras stop rolling, the real aftermath continues. In empty rooms, unanswered questions, and lives permanently altered. This case is over. Its impact is not. You're listening to Coziness Stories. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story waiting for you.